This is Garis Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 258, entitled "Why Do Women Shit Test Men?" Description. This flyer hypothesizes on why women shit test men. It combines modern neuroscience results with evolutionary psychology to posit why women evolved the need to shit test men. The flyer itself. Why Do Women Shit Test Men? By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer hypothesizes on why women shit test men. The MGTOW movement is comprised mostly of psychologists rather than politicians, in parentheses, who tend to be more inclined towards masculism, which is a lot more political. Some of the psychological insights coming from the MGTOW YouTube content providers have been quite interesting, and one wonders how long it will be before the academic psychologists take up these ideas and run with them, particularly performing scientific studies to test these MGTOW-based hypotheses on the psychology of women. The MGTOW make many claims about the psychology of women that are relevant to why so many men are now walking away from traditional marriage and paternity. The MGTOWs are claiming, for example, that women are hypergamous, that is, always on the lookout for a more exploitable male she can monkey branch to, who has more resources to give her and her babies. MGTOWs talk about the red pill, that is, the idea that women don't love men, but rather love men's exploitability, and as soon as a man loses that exploitability by a woman, she will coldly and disloyally dump him in favour of a more exploitable man. Another of the psychological hypotheses made by the MGTOWs concerns the shit test that women use routinely on men. This flyer is about why women use shit tests and how they evolved. A shit test, as its very label implies, is usually some remark made by a woman to her man that tests him in some way. Often the remark is quite negative and is designed to annoy him, so that one wonders why women bother to do these tests, given that they only annoy their man. Why do women insist on shit testing men if they only make her appear more negative in men's eyes? What purpose is served by the shit test from the woman's perspective? How is it in the woman's interest to shit test her man? Why do women shit test men? This flyer hypothesizes. This flyer hypothesizes a reason for female shit testing based on modern neuroscience knowledge and linked with some evolutionary psychology to come up with a plausible and rational explanation for why and how female shit testing evolved and why women use it. At face value, shit testing seems pointless. As a man, one wonders why women constantly put men through these alien and stupid shit tests. But if the hypothesis below is correct, then one sees that there is good reason for them, despite the fact that they seem so annoying to men. So one wonders why women do them, because there is a limit to the patience and tolerance of men towards women. If women shit test men too much, then the man will simply walk away. So how could shit testing have evolved in the first place? A shit test is usually a real irritation to the man. I'll give a real-life example from my own experience. My current marriage is on the rocks and will terminate in about a year once I have finished converting my paper library into electronic form, and I move out of my fourth wife's apartment and relocate to Melbourne, Australia, to take up a generous offer of my sister, who will buy a 1-bedroom apartment and let me live in it for free. My third wife, Chinese also, stole half my savings, so I'm rather poor now. This moderate poverty impacted on the hypogamous instinct of my fourth wife, who, being female, wants to have a partner who is capable of providing resources to her, even though in reality she was a professor with a good income and did not need to parasite off a man's money. She had plenty of her own. Nevertheless, it goes against a woman's evolved instinct to live with a man who she feels is not capable of giving her resources. After all, women evolved to be dependent on men for their very survival, because women could not hunt. They could not leave their useless babies for days, chasing big game for meat the way men can. So women evolved to be dependent on men, to be given scarce male-hunted meat that was needed to keep them and their babies alive. So it became critical for women to feel assured that their men, who supplied their women with meat, were reliable. Their very lives depended on that reliability. If a man started losing interest in his woman and became increasingly indifferent towards her, then that could be disastrous for her. So it was in her self-interest to know beforehand whether her man had lost interest in her and would soon throw her out to starve or fend on her own. So women evolved the shit test, so goes the hypothesis, to deliberately provoke the man into reacting hostilely towards her, giving her vital information about his level of commitment and interest in her, that is, whether he could be relied upon to keep supplying her and her babies with precious and scarce male-hunted meat. For the man, a shit test can be really annoying. For example, when my current wife said to me, quote, "I'm going to look for an apartment to buy in the city where my parents and younger sister live later this month," end quote. A full month later, and she did not keep her word. She did not go to that city to look for an apartment. I interpret her statement to be just another one of her femalian shit tests. I assume she did it to elicit a reaction from me along the following lines, in parentheses, with me thinking aloud, quote, "Oh my gosh, if she buys an apartment in another city, then that will probably force me to move out sooner than I had hoped. She's goading me, trying to see how I feel about her throwing me out." A month later, and she and I still live in separate rooms in the same apartment, with the status quo being that we hardly talk to each other. I prefer it that way, rather than have to put up with her stupid shit tests and her nagging. When I arrive in Melbourne and take up my sister's offer, I will very probably go into full MGTOW monk mode and not have anything to do with women. After some score of girlfriends and 4 wives, I've had it with women. I'm now 70. My libido has reduced enough that I'm no longer cunt-driven, and since I can't share my intellectual passions, in brackets, of pure math, physics, and philosophy, close bracket, with women, I don't need women, period. I'm bored by female conversation. Women don't have original opinions. They have limited horizons and quickly annoy me. So I'll go MGTOW monk probably for the rest of my life, as my father has for the past 3 decades. I suspect what is going on with my current wife shit testing is that she's trying to judge the level of my attachment to her. I don't give her much information because thanks to my listening to MGTOW videos on femalian shit testing, I've learned to ignore them from her, which is not what women want. What women want is to provoke their man so that he reacts with strong emotion and annoyance, so that she can learn that he still cares enough about her, that her negative shit test has annoyed him enough for him to become impatient and verbally violent with her. The irony is that modern neuroscience, that is MRI scan, that's magnetic resonance imaging, MRI scans have shown that when a woman shit tests a man and he reacts very negatively, her brain actually releases pleasure hormones from the pleasure center, making her feel good. What? This sounds nonsensical, yet it is what happens. So does this imply that women are sadists? That is, deliberately gaining pleasure at their man's expense? You could argue that way, but, and here's the hypothesis, the reason why the woman feels pleasure at having provoked such a negative reaction from her man is that his reaction tells her that he still cares enough about her that he bothers to get annoyed, rather than being like me now, who feels no connection to my current wife, that my indifference shows her that I will leave her, so that she will now probably live alone for the rest of her life, a sobering thought for her. In the distant past, a woman's very survival depended on her knowing whether her man would continue to supply her with meat. So when her shit testing caused her man to explode in verbal anger and maybe even a bitch slapping or worse, it was actually a source of real relief to her to know that he still cared enough about her to bother to get annoyed. So her shit testing may seem sadistic to the man, but it was of vital importance to her to know that she would keep her man for the time being, that he would continue to provide her and her babies with meat that he hunted. So women evolved, the hypothesis goes, the ability to shit test men, to judge ahead of time, that is before he became indifferent to her, and throw her out of his cave to her probable death from starvation or exposure to the elements, or from wild animals. With such a warning of his growing indifference, she might have enough time to monkey branch to another man who has expressed an interest in her and her cunt, her most precious resource and bargaining tool. Knowing that her man still cared enough about her to react negatively to her shit test was such a relief for her, such a release from stress, that it felt pleasurable to her, hence the release of pleasure hormones from her pleasure center in her brain. That is the hypothesis. Now, how could it be tested scientifically? For that matter, how could any of the MGTOW psychological hypotheses be tested scientifically by modern psychology? Question mark. How could the main MGTOW psychological hypotheses of the red pill, women's hypergamy, the shit test, etc. be tested? Traditional psychologists such as Freud, Jung, etc. made no mention of such ideas in their works. They lived before the strong modern influence of evolutionary psychology. That is, the tendency in this case to look upon personality traits in women as the result of their evolutionary past, for example, as the above hypothesis illustrates. I am not a professional psychologist, nor especially an evolutionary psychologist, so I posit the above hypothesis merely